A homeless boy returns a millionaire's briefcase and gets $10,000, but is robbed the next day. The late afternoon sun dipped low over the city, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. 13-year-old David trudged along the uneven cobblestones, clutching a threadbare sack filled with empty bottles. His clothes were patched and worn, his sneakers scuffed beyond repair, and his face bore the grime of another long day spent scavenging for recyclables to sell. Life had been cruel to David. He had no family to go home to, no comforting presence waiting for him at the end of the day. Tragedy had struck his life years ago, leaving him alone in a world that seemed indifferent to his existence. Now, he lived in an abandoned, crumbling house on the outskirts of town, surviving on sheer determination and the few coins he earned each day. The bustling streets carried the sounds of distant laughter, conversations, and the occasional honk of a car horn. David's stomach growled as he passed by a street vendor selling hot pies, their warm aroma teasing his senses. He stopped briefly, gazing longingly at the pastries before shaking his head and moving on. He didn't have the luxury of such indulgences, not today. As he turned onto a busier avenue, his attention was caught by a large terrace restaurant. The tables were filled with well-dressed patrons, their laughter and animated conversations filling the air. The clink of glasses and the aroma of roasted meats wafted toward him, making him pause. At one of the terrace tables sat two men, their polished suits gleaming in the golden sunlight. They leaned over a table strewn with papers, their conversation intense. One of the men, tall with silver hair and an air of authority, gestured animatedly as he spoke. The other, younger and sharp-featured, nodded occasionally, taking notes. David slowed his steps, drawn in by the scene. He couldn't hear their words, but the way they moved and spoke made it clear they were important. Their world was so far removed from his own that it felt almost surreal, like something out of a dream. As David stood there, unnoticed, the two men abruptly rose from their seats. The silver-haired man clapped the younger one on the shoulder, their conversation clearly concluded. They gathered their things quickly, shaking hands before striding off down the street. It was then that David noticed something. A sleek, black leather briefcase lying under their table. He hesitated, glancing around. The waitstaff hadn't noticed it, and the men were already halfway down the block, their long strides carrying them farther away. David's heart raced. He knew what he had to do. "Hey! Wait!" he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. But the men didn't turn. They seemed entirely unaware of the bag they'd left behind. David darted forward, grabbing the briefcase. It was heavier than he expected, the fine leather cool and unfamiliar against his rough hands. "Sir, you forgot this!" he called again, louder this time. Still, the men didn't turn. With a burst of determination, David took off after them. The weight of the briefcase slowed him down, but he didn't stop. He weaved through the crowded sidewalk, dodging pedestrians and narrowly avoiding a collision with a street vendor's cart. The men turned a corner, and David pushed himself to run faster. His chest burned, and his legs screamed in protest, but he couldn't let them disappear. By the time he rounded the corner, his breath was coming in short gasps. He spotted the men farther down the street, their silhouettes moving against the backdrop of the setting sun. "Wait!" David shouted again, his voice hoarse from exertion. This time, the silver-haired man turned, his brow furrowed in confusion. The younger man followed suit, his expression mirroring his companion's. Their eyes fell on David as he staggered toward them, clutching the briefcase tightly to his chest. When he finally reached them, he bent over, hands on his knees, struggling to catch his breath. The briefcase dangled from one hand, its weight pulling at his small frame. "You? You forgot this," David panted, holding the bag out toward them. For a moment, the two men exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of surprise and curiosity. "Thank you," the silver-haired man said finally, his voice deep and commanding. He stepped forward, taking the briefcase from David's trembling hands. David straightened, his breathing still labored. He felt their eyes on him, as if they were trying to make sense of the disheveled boy who had gone to such lengths to return their forgotten bag. The silver-haired man's gaze softened, and a small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "What's your name, son?" "David," the boy replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, David," the man said, his tone warmer now, "you just did something very important." David stood awkwardly before the two men, still catching his breath. The silver-haired man, now holding the briefcase, studied him closely. There was something in his gaze, a mixture of curiosity and gratitude. "This," the man said, lifting the briefcase slightly, "isn't just an ordinary bag. Do you know what you've just done, David?" David shook his head, his heart still racing. Inside the briefcase was everything Thomas Larkson, one of the city's most successful real estate developers, needed for his latest project: plans, contracts, and blueprints for a new housing estate that would transform an entire neighborhood. Losing it would have been disastrous, costing months of work and millions of dollars. The younger man beside Thomas chuckled, patting his boss on the shoulder. "You've got quite the guardian angel here." Thomas nodded. "You're right, Ethan." Turning back to David, he asked, "Do you live around here?" David hesitated. He didn't want to admit he lived in an abandoned house on the edge of the city. "Sort of," he said quietly, looking at the ground. "Well," Tomas said, his voice kind but firm, "we can't just let you run off after what you've done for us. Come on, let me buy you dinner." David blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. "Dinner?" Tomas smiled. "Yes, dinner. It's the least I can do to thank you." David opened his mouth to protest, but his stomach betrayed him, letting out a loud growl. Ethan laughed, and even Tomas couldn't suppress a grin. "Come on," Tomas urged, motioning back toward the restaurant they'd left. "Let's get you something to eat." The restaurant felt even more intimidating the second time David stepped onto the terrace. The soft glow of the chandeliers above, the neatly arranged tables, and the faint hum of polite conversation created a world far removed from anything he'd ever known. Thomas led him to a table near the corner, where the noise was quieter, and pulled out a chair for him. David sat hesitantly, his hands fidgeting in his lap. "Order anything you like," Thomas said, sliding a menu toward him. David stared at the menu, his eyes skimming over words he didn't recognize. Everything sounded too extravagant. He couldn't bring himself to choose something expensive. It didn't feel right. "Just rice and water," David mumbled. Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't push. "Rice and water it is," he said, signaling the waiter. As the waiter left to place their orders, Tomas leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "David," he began, his tone gentle, "I noticed you're out on your own. Where's your family?" David's fingers tightened on the edge of the table. The question hit harder than he expected. He looked down, his voice barely audible. They're gone." Tomas didn't press, sensing the weight behind the boy's words. "I'm sorry to hear that," he said sincerely. David hesitated, his chest tightening. For years he had carried the story of his family's tragedy alone, never speaking of it to anyone. But something about Thomas's voice, the genuine care in his words, made David feel like he could share. "It was a fire," David said quietly, his voice trembling. "Our house. It burned down in the middle of the night. I don't even remember what happened. I just woke up, and there was smoke everywhere. I tried to find them, but—" He swallowed hard, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I was the only one who made it out." Tomas's expression softened, his heart aching for the boy. The scars on David's neck suddenly made sense, and he could only imagine the pain this young boy had endured. "I'm so sorry, David," Tomas said again, his voice heavy with emotion. David shrugged, his gaze fixed on the table. "I've been on my own ever since. I do what I can to get by, turning in bottles, odd jobs. It's not much, but it's something." Tomas leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. This boy had every reason to give up, yet he hadn't. Instead, he'd chosen to live honestly and do the right thing, even when it would have been easier to walk away with the briefcase. "You're an incredible young man," Tomas said finally. David looked up, surprised. "I'm just trying to survive." "No," Tomas said firmly, shaking his head. "What you did today wasn't about survival. It was about doing the right thing, even when no one was looking." "That's rare, David." Their conversation was interrupted as the waiter returned with their food. Tomas had ordered a hearty steak and vegetables for himself, while David's small plate of rice and a glass of water were set before him. David ate quickly, trying not to draw attention to himself, though he couldn't help sneaking glances at Tomas's meal. Tomas noticed and smiled. "You know, you could have ordered more than rice," he said lightly. David shrugged. "This is fine. I'm not used to fancy food anyway." Tomas chuckled but didn't push further. As their meal wound down, Tomas leaned forward again, his expression thoughtful. "David, I want to do something for you. You've proven you're honest and hardworking, and I think you deserve a chance at something better." David's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Tomas reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. He scribbled something quickly, tore off the check, and slid it across the table. David's eyes widened as he read the amount. $10,000. "What? What is this?" he stammered. "It's not charity," Tomas said firmly. "It's an opportunity. Take this money, invest it, and double it. If you can do that, come find me. I'll give you a job and help you get on your feet." David stared at the check, his hands trembling. Are you serious?" Tomas nodded. "Dead serious. You've already shown me you're capable of great things. Now it's up to you to prove it to yourself." For the first time in years, David felt something other than the constant weight of survival. He felt hope. I'll do it," he said, his voice steady. "Good," Tomas replied, a smile tugging at his lips. "I look forward to seeing what you do with it." David stared at the check in his hands, the numbers blurring as his mind raced. $10,000. It was more money than he had ever seen in his life. He struggled to wrap his head around the idea that Thomas Larkson, a man he had met only hours ago, was trusting him with such a large sum. "This is a lot of money," David said, his voice trembling. "It is," Thomas replied, his tone serious but encouraging. "And that's why I want you to be smart with it." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I'm not just giving you money, David. I'm giving you a chance. But how you use it will determine what happens next." David nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't even know where to start." "That's okay," Thomas said with a reassuring smile. "Let's figure it out together." Thomas pulled out a small notebook from his briefcase and flipped to a blank page. He jotted down a few bullet points, speaking as he wrote. "First, you'll need a safe way to keep this money. You can't just carry cash around. It's too risky. So, the first step is to open a savings account at a bank. David tilted his head. A bank account? Yes, Tomas said. It's simple to set up, and it'll keep your money secure. Once it's there, you can use it to invest in something that will grow over time. David furrowed his brow. What kind of investments? Tomas leaned back in his chair, considering. There are a few options. You could look into stocks, for example, buying small shares of companies that might grow in value. It's a bit risky, though, so you'll need to do your research and start small. David nodded, absorbing the information like a sponge. Another option, Tomas continued, is to lend the money through a platform that connects borrowers and investors. It's called peer-to-peer lending. You'd earn interest over time, and it's usually safer than stocks. David's eyes widened. People borrow money from me? Exactly, Tomas said. It's like being a mini bank. But again, you'd need to choose wisely. There's no such thing as a guaranteed return, so you have to think carefully. Thomas paused, tapping his pen against the table. And then there's something a bit simpler, buying and selling. If you can find something valuable that's underpriced, antiques, rare collectibles, even old tools, you can sell it for a profit. It's a little more hands-on, but can be very rewarding. David's head spun as he listened, the possibilities unfolding before him like an unfamiliar map. It was overwhelming, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of excitement, of possibility. How will I know what to pick? David asked, his voice tentative. You'll have to learn, Thomas said with a smile. Read, ask questions, and don't be afraid to start small. The important thing is to take your time and make informed choices. Remember, this isn't a race. David nodded, gripping the check tighter. He wasn't entirely sure how he would begin, but Thomas's guidance gave him something he hadn't felt in years: direction. As they left the restaurant, Thomas walked with David toward the nearest bank, explaining more about savings accounts and how they worked. The city lights flickered above them, casting long shadows on the pavement. You'll need identification to open an account, Tomas said. Do you have any paperwork? Birth certificate? Anything like that? David's face fell. No, nothing like that. Tomas frowned, rubbing his chin. That complicates things, but it's not impossible. I'll help you sort it out. David blinked, surprised by Tomas's offer. Why are you helping me so much? Tomas stopped walking and looked down at the boy. Because I see something in you, David. You've been dealt a hard hand in life, but you didn't let it make you bitter. You did the right thing when most people wouldn't have bothered. That tells me you're worth investing in. David looked away, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to people believing in him. The next morning, David woke up in his usual spot, a corner of the abandoned house he called home. But something felt different. The check Thomas had given him was tucked securely in his pocket, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope. His first stop was a local library, where he spent hours reading about the basics of investing. He scribbled notes on scraps of paper, trying to make sense of terms like diversification and compound interest. It was difficult and confusing, but David was determined. Later, with Thomas's help, he managed to set up a small savings account. The banker raised an eyebrow at David's tattered clothes and young age, but Tomas's presence smoothed over any questions. With the account in place, David took his first step into investing. After days of research, he decided to split the money 3 ways. A small portion went into peer-to-peer lending, as Thomas had suggested, earning modest but steady interest. Another part was used to buy second-hand tools, which he refurbished and sold to local craftsmen. The rest was invested in a low-risk stock, one tied to a local company he'd read about in the library. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Weeks turned into months, and David's efforts began to pay off. The tools he sold brought in consistent profits, and his peer-to-peer lending portfolio grew steadily. The stock, though slow, showed signs of growth as well. Bit by bit, his small investments began to snowball. He didn't spend a single penny of the original $10,000. Instead, he reinvested every profit he made, letting it grow. It was hard work, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. One day, as David tallied his earnings, he realized something incredible. His total balance had just crossed $20,000. He sat back, stunned. He had done it. With his heart pounding, he pulled out the business card Thomas had given him and dialed the number. "Thomas Larkson speaking," came the familiar deep voice. David's voice cracked with emotion as he spoke. "It's David. I did it. I doubled the money." There was a pause, then a warm chuckle on the other end of the line. "David," Thomas said, his tone filled with pride, "I knew you would." David's heart raced as he clutched the phone. Thomas's voice warm and encouraging on the other end of the line. For the first time, the weight of survival that had hung over David for years felt lighter. He had doubled the $10,000 just as Thomas had challenged him to do, and it wasn't luck. It was hard work, persistence, and careful choices. "You've done something incredible, David," Thomas said. "Meet me tomorrow at my office. We'll talk about the next steps." David's grin was wide enough to hurt his cheeks. "I'll be there." The conversation ended, and David placed the phone back on its cradle, his hands trembling with excitement. He glanced at the envelope where he kept his earnings, proof of months of effort. He hadn't withdrawn everything from the bank, but a good portion of his earnings was in cash, tucked securely under a loose floorboard in the abandoned house he called home. "Tomorrow," he thought, gripping the envelope tightly. "Tomorrow, everything changes." The next morning, the city buzzed with its usual energy. David woke before dawn, unable to sleep. He dressed in his best clothes, a clean shirt and slightly oversized pants, and retrieved the envelope from its hiding place. The money felt like hope in his hands as he stepped onto the street. The cool morning air invigorated him. He headed toward the bus stop, replaying the moment in his head when he'd hand the envelope to Thomas, proud of what he'd accomplished. But fate had other plans. David was only a few blocks from the bus station when it happened. He turned onto a quiet side street, his path clear. Out of nowhere, two men emerged from the shadows. Their clothes were worn, their eyes sharp and calculating. "Hey, kid," one of them said, stepping into David's path. The other moved behind him, cutting off his escape. David's stomach sank. He clutched the envelope tighter, taking a step back. I don't want any trouble," he stammered. The taller man smirked. "Neither do we. Just hand over the envelope and we'll be on our way." David's pulse thundered in his ears. "No," he said, his voice shaking. "It's my money." The shorter man scoffed. "Kid, you don't want to do this the hard way." Before David could react, the taller man lunged forward, grabbing the envelope. David struggled, his small frame no match for the man's strength. "Stop! Please, I need that!" David cried, desperation lacing his voice. The taller man shoved David to the ground, his breath hot with irritation. "It's ours now!" With that, the two men disappeared down the alley, leaving David sprawled on the pavement. His hands scraped against the rough concrete, and tears stung his eyes. He sat there for a moment, stunned, before forcing himself to his feet. The envelope was gone. Months of work, every careful investment, every penny he'd saved. It was all gone. David stumbled to a nearby bench, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. His mind raced, oscillating between despair and rage. What am I going to do now? Thomas trusted me. I've failed. But as the sun climbed higher into the sky, something shifted inside him. The despair began to recede, replaced by a familiar determination. I can't give up. Not now. David wiped his tears and clenched his fists. He still had his account at the bank. Most of his money had been in that envelope, but not all of it. He had a small amount left, just enough to start over. When David arrived at Thomas's office later that day, his shoulders were hunched and his steps were slower than usual. Thomas's assistant greeted him warmly and led him into the spacious office. Thomas stood from behind his desk, his face lighting up when he saw David. "There you are," he said. "Let's see what you've got." David hesitated, clutching his hands tightly. "What's wrong?" Thomas asked, his voice immediately softening. David took a shaky breath and told him everything: the robbery, the money he'd lost, the way the men had overpowered him. He expected disappointment, maybe even anger. But Thomas didn't react the way David feared. Instead, he walked around the desk, placing a reassuring hand on David's shoulder. "I'm sorry that happened to you," Thomas said quietly. "But the fact that you're here, willing to face me after everything, that tells me you're stronger than you realize." David blinked, his chest tightening. "But I lost everything. I failed." "No, you didn't," Thomas said firmly. "You've already proven that you can succeed. You took $10,000 and turned it into something greater. A setback like this doesn't erase that." David's throat tightened. "But I don't know if I can do it again." Thomas smiled. "Yes, you can. And this time, you won't have to do it alone." He returned to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out another envelope. "Here's what we're going to do. I'm giving you another $10,000, not as a replacement, but as a second chance. I'll help you figure out where to invest it, and this time we'll put safeguards in place to protect what you earn." David's eyes widened. "You'd really do that? After everything?" "David," Thomas said, his tone warm, "life isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up. And if there's one thing I know about you, it's that you never stop fighting." With Thomas's guidance, David started again. They worked together to create a more secure plan, investing the money in a combination of peer-to-peer lending and a managed stock portfolio. Thomas even introduced David to one of his financial advisors, who explained how to diversify investments and minimize risks. This time, David learned not just about earning money, but about protecting it. As the months passed, his investments began to grow once more. Slowly but surely, David rebuilt what he had lost, and this time he didn't just double the original amount. He tripled it. When he returned to Thomas's office months later, his face was brighter, his shoulders straighter. "Thomas," David said, setting a detailed financial report on the desk, "I think I'm ready for that job you promised." Thomas grinned, shaking David's hand. "You've earned it." The bustling office of Larkson Enterprises was unlike anything David had ever experienced. The tall glass windows offered a panoramic view of the city's skyline, sunlight reflecting off steel and glass structures that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. Employees moved with purpose, their conversations blending into the faint hum of keyboards and ringing phones. David stood near the reception desk, clutching a folder Thomas had handed him earlier. His shoes, though polished, still felt slightly out of place on the marble floors. For months, he had worked tirelessly to rebuild what he'd lost, guided by Thomas's mentorship and unwavering faith in his abilities. Now, standing in the heart of Thomas's empire, David was ready to take the next step in his journey. Thomas approached, his presence commanding yet warm. He was dressed sharply as always, his silver hair gleaming under the office lights. "David," he said with a smile, "welcome to your first day." David's nervousness melted slightly under Thomas's steady gaze. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Larkson," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Thomas," the man corrected gently. "We're partners now. No need for formality." David blinked. "Partners?" Thomas chuckled. "That's right. You've shown me you're capable of more than just following instructions. You're a thinker, a doer, and I want you to learn what it's like to make decisions that shape lives. So, today, you're not just starting a job. You're starting your future." David couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, he felt like he truly belonged somewhere. Thomas introduced David to the staff, guiding him through the departments and explaining how the company operated. From marketing to project management, David was fascinated by the intricate web of moving parts that kept the enterprise running. In the financial division, Thomas paused by a desk cluttered with reports. "This is where I think you'll fit in best for now," he said. "You've already shown a knack for managing money. Let's see how you do with bigger numbers." David nodded, his nerves returning as he met the gaze of an older employee who handed him a spreadsheet. The numbers were daunting, millions in projections and balances, but David felt a spark of determination. Over the next weeks, David worked harder than ever before. He arrived early, stayed late, and asked endless questions. Thomas made sure to check in regularly, offering advice and encouragement. "You don't have to know everything right away," Thomas said one evening after catching David poring over a thick report. "What matters is that you're willing to learn." David nodded, grateful for Thomas's patience. One day, Thomas invited David to join him on a site visit to the housing development project that had sparked their initial meeting. The site was a sprawling landscape of cranes, construction equipment, and half-built structures. Workers moved purposefully, their shouts echoing across the open space. Thomas led David through the site, explaining the challenges and triumphs of bringing the vision to life. "This," Thomas said, gesturing to the buildings, "is why I do what I do. It's not just about profits, it's about creating something that lasts. Homes, schools, parks, places where people can thrive." David looked at Thomas, admiration clear in his expression. "You really care about this, don't you?" Thomas smiled. "More than anything. And if you're willing, I want you to be part of it." David's heart swelled. "I want that too." But just as everything seemed to fall into place, another challenge loomed. One evening, Thomas called David into his office, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "David, there's something you need to know," he said, gesturing for him to sit. David sat down, his palms sweating. "What's going on?" Thomas leaned forward, his hands clasped. "There's been a problem with one of our projects, a serious one. One of our key investors pulled out unexpectedly, and it's left us with a significant funding gap." David frowned, his mind racing. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that the entire development could stall if we don't find a solution soon," Thomas admitted. David's stomach churned. He had seen how much this project meant to Thomas and the community it was meant to serve. Losing it wasn't an option. "Is there anything I can do to help?" David asked, determination in his voice. Thomas studied him for a moment, then nodded. "There might be. We're planning to meet with potential investors next week. I want you to be there. It'll be your chance to see how these deals are made and to prove you've got what it takes to be a part of this company's future." David's chest tightened, both with anxiety and excitement. "I'll be ready," he promised. The days leading up to the meeting were a whirlwind of preparation. David worked alongside Thomas and his team, studying every detail of the project and practicing his pitch. Thomas encouraged him every step of the way, offering advice and pushing him to think critically. "You've already shown me you can handle tough situations," Thomas said one evening. "This is just the next step." When the day of the meeting arrived, David stood beside Thomas in the boardroom, facing a group of sharp-eyed investors. His heart pounded as Thomas began the presentation, outlining the vision for the development and its potential impact. Then, Thomas turned to David. "My associate, David, will explain the financial viability of the project," he said, stepping aside. David took a deep breath and stepped forward. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady as he spoke. He outlined the projections, the expected returns, and the long-term benefits with confidence he hadn't known he possessed. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment before one of the investors nodded approvingly. "Impressive," the man said. By the end of the meeting, 2 investors had agreed to step in, saving the project from collapse. Later, as David and Thomas walked out of the building, Thomas clapped a hand on David's shoulder. "You were brilliant in there," he said, pride evident in his voice. David grinned, a sense of accomplishment washing over him. "I couldn't have done it without you." Thomas shook his head. "You've come so far, David. And this is just the beginning." David looked out at the city skyline, the possibilities stretching before him like the horizon. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just surviving, he was thriving. Months had passed since David's pivotal moment in the boardroom, and his life had transformed in ways he could never have imagined. The boy who had once scraped by collecting bottles and living in an abandoned house was now a permanent partner at Larkson Enterprises, a respected name within the company. Thomas had kept his word, mentoring David and giving him the tools to succeed. But it was David's drive, honesty, and willingness to learn that had truly cemented his place. The team respected him, and investors had come to trust his sharp instincts and clear understanding of the numbers. One afternoon, Thomas called David into his office. The older man gestured to the chair across from his desk, his expression warm. "You've proven yourself in ways I never expected," Thomas said. "I've seen you grow from a determined boy into someone I'm proud to call a partner." David felt a lump in his throat. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said honestly. Thomas chuckled. "You did more than you realize, David. And now, it's time for you to take the next step. You've worked hard, and you deserve to start building a life outside these walls." He slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was a deed to a small but beautiful house in the heart of the city, a place David could call his own. David's hands trembled as he looked at Thomas. "You're serious? This is mine?" "It's ours," Thomas said, smiling. "Think of it as the first step in building your future. You've earned it." The house was perfect. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood with a small garden and cozy rooms, it felt like a haven. For David, who had spent years living in the shadows of abandonment, it was more than just a house. It was a home. A few weeks later, David made another dream come true. He stood outside a local shelter, watching as the staff brought out a young dog with soft, floppy ears and bright eyes. The pup wagged its tail furiously, as though sensing it was about to meet someone special. David crouched down, letting the dog sniff his hand. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. The dog licked his fingers, his tail wagging even faster. It was love at first sight. David brought the dog home, naming him Max. The pup quickly became a beloved companion, following David from room to room and curling up at his feet whenever he worked late into the night. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, David sat on the porch of his new house. Max lay beside him, his head resting on David's lap. In the distance, the city lights flickered, a reminder of how far he had come. Thomas joined him, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to David and sat down beside him. "You've come a long way," Thomas said, his voice filled with pride. David smiled, his hand absently scratching Max's ears. "I couldn't have done it without you." "You've done more than enough to prove yourself," Thomas said, "and you've reminded me why I started this journey in the first place. It's about people, David. It's about creating opportunities, building trust, and changing lives." David nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude and hope. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't," Thomas said. David's story is a reminder that no matter how difficult the past may be, determination, honesty, and kindness can lead to incredible opportunities. Did this touching story inspire you? Share your thoughts in the comments. What part of David's journey moved you the most? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow for more uplifting tales of resilience, courage, and transformation. Together, let's celebrate the power of second chances and the triumph of the human spirit. See you in the next heartwarming story.